Story 1. Und wenn sie nicht gestorben sind, leben sie noch heute. If they have not died, they are still alive today. Story 2. Hungarian. És boldogan éltek, míg meg nem haltak. English. And they lived happily until they died. Story 3. حكايتي مشاة من واد لواد وأنا بقيت مع الناس الجواد. My story went from one river to another, and I remain with good people. Story 4. Och så levde de lyckliga i alla sina dagar. And so they lived happily for all their days. Story 5. What a delightful thread. I love learning all these phrases. Story 6. There are two versions in Turkish. Gökten yüksek elma düştü. Biri anlatana, biri dinleyene, biri yazana. 3 apples fell from the sky. One for the teller, one for the listener, one for the author. Onlar ermiş müridine, biz sakalım karavetin. They found happiness, we go to bed. Karavet is a very old type of bed, and the word is only in use in this phrase. Story 7. Zadzwonił dzwonc, a pohádky je konec. The bell rang and the fairy tale is over. Story 8. Bet aquí gos y gat. Aket konta ya se acabat. There is a dog and a cat. This story is now over. Story 9. Vivieron felices y comieron perdices. They lived happily and ate partridges. Obviously, it is about the rhyme more than the meaning. Story 10. French. Ils vécurent heureux et eurent beaucoup d'enfants. English. And they lived happily and had many children. Story 11. Ja kui nad pole surnud, elavad nad õnnelikult tänapäevani. Story 12. In Dutch. En ze leefden nog lang en gelukkig. In English. And they lived long and happily. Story 13. Icelandic. Kvarter ute i mire, settestur postire. Ute æventýri. Literal translation. A cat out in the marsh sat up on the steering. Outside there is adventure. Story 14. In Greece we say, kai zisimi aftikala kai amais kalitera, which translates to, and they lived well and we lived better. Story 15. My grandfather would say, flut, flut, my story is out. Literally, whistle, whistle, my story is done. Story 16. Atipical guanís y colorín, colorado, este cuento se ha acabado. It cannot be literally translated. Color and Colorado are just rhyming words with no real meaning. Colorado at best is close to colored. So the literal translation is, Colorin, Colorado, this story is over. If I had to create a personal version, it would be, colored and told. This old story can now be closed. I don't know, laughing out loud. Story 17. Și-au fericiți până la adânci bătrâneți. And they lived happily into old age. Story 18. Fela, ngam tsomi and stevajrecale i nisikosa. Story 19. I stali ani żyć i nażywać dobro. And then they began to live, prosper, and accumulate wealth. Story 20. E viveram felizes para sempre. Ao terminar conto contado oralmente, todos cantam. Vitória, acabou a história. And they lived happily ever after. When a tale is told aloud and ends, everyone chants. Victory, the story is over. Story 20. Ja he elivät onnellisina elämänsä loppuun asti. And they lived happily to the end of their life. The word life is singular, which is notable because the plural form is more common. Story 22. I don't know Arabic, but don't the tales in 1001 Nights end with something like, and they lived happily until the destroyer of delights and the sacker of cities came upon them, and other extravagant epithets for death? Story 23. Tsica Majka, gotova je prica. Old man Micah, the story is over. Story 24. I think I saw this in one of Andrew Lang's translated collected fairy tales, and it stuck with me. My tale is done, the mouse has run. Whoever catches it can make a big furry hat. Story 25. Meditashi means wonderful or, more literally, extreme praise. Story 26. E vissero per sempre felici e contenti. And they lived happily ever after. Happy and content are synonyms. Story 27. Fueron felices y comieron perdices. They were happy and ate partridges. Story 28. Och they lived hamingjusum till æviloka. They lived happily for the rest of their lives. Story 29. Отказоч кнец, а хто слухав, молодец. Here the story ends. Whoever listened is a good boy or girl. Ось вам казка, амін бублик вваяска. Here is your tale, and I am getting a string of bagels like many small bagels or pretzels threaded together. Story 30. Swedish. Och så levde de lyckliga I alla sina dagar. English. And they lived happily all their days. Story 31. This is for the Russian fairy tales that end with a party, usually a wedding. И я там был, мёд пиво пил. По усам текло, а в рот не попало. And I was there drinking mead and beer. It ran down my mustache but did not reach my mouth. Story 32. Og de levede lykkeligt til deres dages ende. And they lived happily till the end of their days. Story 33. Not the last line per se, but orated stories used to be followed by Sun Lai Sun Ko Mala, Ban Lai Full Ko Mala, Yo Katha by Kuntha Jala, Ban Bella Kuru Kuru Ijala. Listeners receive a gold garland. The storyteller receives a flower garland. May the story go to heaven. May it be told smoothly, without hesitation or forgetfulness. Story 34. In Persian, the phrase is Gesi ma bi sar rezid. Kalak bi kunash narisid. The literal translation is our story has come to an end, but the crow did not reach its home. I do not know where it comes from. As a child, I heard it used to conclude many stories, and it usually has little bearing on the story itself. Story 35. وعاشوا في تبات ونبات وجبوا أولاد وبنات. وعاشا في تبات ونبات وجبا أولاد وبنات. They lived in wealth and abundance and had many boys and girls. Non-romantic stories ended with just the wealth and abundance part. In my rural village, stories ended with a phrase meaning, "It's over, schmover," and the chicken laid an egg. It meant, "It's almost morning. The chickens are waking up, so go to sleep." Story 36. In old Marathi tales I have wrote the phrase, "Asha prakare satha uttaranchi kahani pach uttarani purn jhali." Asha prakare satha uttaranchi kahani pach uttaran purn jhali. I'm not sure what it is meant to convey, but literally it says, and so the story of 60 answers was completed in 5 answers. Story 37. I żyli długo I szczęśliwie. They lived long and happily. Story 38. Zisa naftikala, kiemiska litera. They lived well and we lived better. Story 39. Meditashi. A very literal translation is very happy, very happy. A proper translation is happily ever after. Story 40. Y aquí se rompió una taza y cada quien para su casa. A cup was broken here, so everyone go home. Story 41. Y colorín colorado, este cuento se ha acabado. Literal translation. And colorful red, this story is over. Idiomatic meaning. A playful, sing-song way to say, and that's the end of the story. Story 42. Od vam kaska, meni bubliki uvieska. You've got the fairy tale. I get the batch of bread rolls. It rhymes in Ukrainian, which is the main reason it is said at the end. It also means that I have told a good story and deserve a treat. Story 43. In Tamil, I do not think we have a specific phrase for fairy tale endings, but all stories I have heard tend to begin with or oru oral, which translates to in this one place. I think that is neat. Story 44. This is a really neat question. The answers are great, mostly European languages so far, and the similarities and differences between neighboring countries are fun to see. I hope you get some more Asian and African language examples too, so you can see how the patterns change across the world. Story neliakimentaviisi. Ja he elivät onnellisina elämänsä loppuun asti. Story 46. Ils vécurent heureux et eurent beaucoup d'enfants. They lived happily ever after and had many children. Story 47. They last forever. Maren shit kejonen yor. Story 48. Vem chayu be'oshel ve'oshel ad etzem hayom hazeh. And they lived in happiness and wealth until this day. Story 49. E vissero tutti felici e contenti. And they all lived happy and content. Story 50. Co trait Pharisite, Panala Dancy Batranidi is roughly. They lived happily ever after in Romanian. Story 51. For the starter. Ikibut, yikinabut peiras hodahichkisnabut. Someone was there, someone wasn't. There was no one but God. For the closure. Hodoyot chenon konsaron jom korkitocheshnevot boshi, vamorast goshavim. God, make the end such that you are pleased and we are redeemed. Story 52. I am not a Russian speaker, but a friend who speaks it as his first language once told me they use a phrase he translated as, "The story is over, and everyone who listened was brave." Isn't that gorgeous? I have never forgotten it. After reading this thread, it may be, вот и сказочки конец. А кто слушал? Молодец. It seems most use good instead of brave. I still prefer brave. Story 53 Lithuanian ir aš ten buvau. Alų ir midų geriau. Per barzdą varvėjo, burnoje neturėjau. English translation, I was there too. I drank beer and mead. It dripped down my beard. I had none in my mouth. Story 54. They lived happily and ate quails. That is in Spain. Story 55. I'm just realizing that lived implies that they are dead now. Story 56. Traditional Italian ending. Un cane va a est e l'altro a ovest. E allora? Questo tizio chiede, cosa vuoi da me? It means one dog is going east and the other dog is going west. So what? And this guy is saying, what do you want from me? Story 57. Så levde de lykkelig i alle sine dager. Og hvis de ikke er døde, så lever de vel enda. And then they lived happily for all of their days. If they are not dead, they are probably still alive. The parenthetical part is not always included, but it is common. Norwegian is generally a fairly casual language in both spoken and written form, though spoken language is even more casual. Fairy tales are usually told in a slightly more formal style. When I say that Ogier de ikke dode is said very casually, I mean that in writing it would almost feel uncomfortably direct if it were not such a common phrase. Spoken, it functions as a comedic tonal shift and is a common fairy tale ending. There is another common ending phrase that can be added after the other one, but it is not equivalent to happily ever after. Snip, snap, snute, og så var eventyret ute. Snip, snap, snout, and then the fairy tale was over. Out here means having run out of something. It is mostly just a silly rhyme. It is often used when reading aloud to signal that story time is over. Many people pause briefly after eventuret, and then put extra emphasis on uta. It is often said like this: snip, snap, snut, ogsa var eventuret pause ut. Story 58, ils vécurent heureux et eurent beaucoup d'enfants. They lived happily and had many children. Story 59, in Urdu we say sab hungsi kushi ren lage, which literally translates to they lived happily and with laughter in their lives. Story 60. In Belgium there are two versions in Dutch, Flemish nze liefden nog lang en gelukkig, which means and they lived long and happy lives, or an older version, en toen kwam in varkens met in lang snut, en het verhalch was ut, which means and then a pig with a long snout appeared and the story was over. This rhymes in Dutch. Story 61. In živeras tas rečno do konca svojich dni. The meaning is the same as in English, and they lived happily ever after. More literally, it means, and they lived in happiness until the end of their lives. Story araverendu, katha kanchiki, manam intiki. Translation, the story goes to Kangxi and we go home. Story 63. During the recent Czech Revolution to escape totalitarian communism, people at demonstrations were chanting what we were told on television was the traditional ending there. The bells are ringing. The fairy tale has ended. Story chaichar, tarpor tara shukhe shantite jibun katate lablu. And then they lived happily ever after. Story 65. Arabic. Watuta tututatun hasalatil haduita. It basically translates to little by little, the story has ended. To be honest, it comes from the Egyptian dialect but is used throughout the Arab world. I like to use it sarcastically. When I know someone is making up a story or lying, I say it and watch them panic. Story 66. There's one from the beginning rather than the end of a story in Irish collected by William Butler Yeats and translated into English. It is a long time since it was, and if they were alive then they would not be alive now. Story 67. Snip, snap, snout. Now the story is out. Story 68. Shamunkalekat ponshashitiam zis povesteasha. Romanian alternative ending. Got on the saddle and wrapped up the story. Story 1960. Inživela sta srećno do konca svojih dni. And they lived happily until the end of their days. Story 70. Romanian fairy tales have several versions of the same lines. Siam încălecat pe osa si v-am spus povestea asta. Endi munte da sadle and told you the story that way. Siam încălecat pe o capsuna si v-am spus o minciuna. Endi munte da strawberry and told you alie. They both rhyme and have a certain rhythm when spoken aloud. There are many other variants on the same idea. Once upon a time is a fost o data sie niciadata, which literally means, there once was like never. Story shivim vechat. Hem chayu be'oshel ve'oshel ad etzem hayomaze. They lived in happiness and wealth to this very day. They added the word wealth as a pun to happiness, and it rolls nicely on the tongue. Story shaddui, amar kothati furalo, norte gachti muralo. Emar kathati firalo, not gachti muralo. My tale has ended, and so has my preparation of the amaranth leaves for cooking. The adage comes from women telling stories to children while preparing vegetables and other ingredients before cooking. Since leafy greens were always prepared last, the time available for stories was determined by that final task. Amaranth leaves, a native red leafy vegetable of South Asia, especially Bengal, are among the most affordable and common greens consumed in the region. The saying reflects these everyday culinary habits. The adage does not promise a happily ever after. Instead, it pulls listeners back to reality, which they inevitably must return to. The tale may be as fantastical and alluring as any fairy tale, but one must return to reality when the amaranth leaves are ready to be cooked. Story hetven harum, Hungarian, boldogonéltek, míg meg nem haltak. It means they lived happily until they died. Story 74. E vissero per sempre felici e contenti. And they lived happily ever after. Story 75. De levede lykkeligt til deres dages ende. They lived happily until the end of their days. I tell my son, slut prut finale. Translation, end, fart the end. Story 76. E vissero per sempre felici e contenti. And they lived forever happy and content. Story 77. In Hindi, fairy tales often end with or vi hamesha kush rahi, which literally translates to and they lived happily forever. Story 78. They lived happily until their deaths. Story 79. Anoter line in Spanish. Calabaza, cada uno para su casa. Translates to pumpkin, everyone go home. Story 80. This question comes up every so often, and the answers are both enlightening and revealing. Story 81. French fairy tales often end with the characters getting married and having many children. Story 82. En ze leefden nog lang en gelukkig. And they lived long and happily. Story 83. Norwegian. Snip, snop, snute, så var dette eventyret ute. Literal translation. Snip, snap, snout. Now the story is finished. Story ogdonda tesera. Gris, que zisanaftikala que miskalitera. Literally. And they lived well and we lived even better. Story shmonim vechamesh. Hem chayu be'oshel ve'oshel ad etzem hayomaze. They lived in happiness and wealth to this day. It's also a wordplay. The Hebrew words meaning happiness and meaning wealth are pronounced the same, so it sounds like they lived in Asher and Asher to this day. Story 86. Så levde de lykkelig alle sine dager. Then they lived happily ever after. Were sometimes used in fairy tales aimed at children. Snip, snap, snut, esse var venturit uda. The snip snap snut part is nonsense, and the last part literally translates to, and then the fairy tale was over. More or less a longer, rhyming version of the end. Story 87. In Urdu we would say kahani khatam paisa hazam, which means that the story has ended and the money has been digested. In other words, there is no more money left to continue the story. Laughing out loud. Story 88. Y colorín colorado, este cuento se ha acabado. Coloredly colored, this tale is over. Colorado means colored, but it also means red. Colorin is a diminutive, a childish play on that word. It makes a nonsensical, pleasant sound that rhymes with acabado, which means it is over. Este cuento, distale, se ha acabado, y sober. Story 89, ils vécurent heureux et eurent beaucoup d'enfants. They lived happily and had many children. Story 90, they were happy and ate partridges. Vivieron felices y comieron perdices. Story 91, and they lived forever happy and content. Italian. Story 92. In Dutch, a fairy tale starts with er was eens, which means there was once, and ends with en ze leefden nog lang en gelukkig, which means and they lived long and happy. Story 93. عاشوا في تبات ونبات وخلفوا صبيان وبنات. They lived in stability and prosperity and gave birth to boys and girls. It rhymes in Arabic, equals nabit, equals banat. It is usually said with a positive, high inflection to indicate a happy ending. Story 94, Dutch, en ze leefden lang en gelukkig. English, and they lived long and happily. Story 95, y vivieron felices y comieron perdices. And they lived happily and ate partridges. Colorín colorado, este cuento se ha acabado. And so the story is over. Storien en indaexi, in Cyprus vui sei, kiesis anaftikala kiemiska litera. They lived well and we lived better. Stauri 97, и жили они долго и счастливо. And sometimes they add, and died on the same day. Story 98, ils vécurent heureux et eurent beaucoup d'enfants. They lived happily and had many children. Story 99, og de levede lykkeligt til deres dages ende. This Danish sentence essentially translates to, and they lived happily until the end of their days. I remember a television show that told slightly modernized versions of Hans Christian Andersen's stories and used this line at the end of each episode. It was always chilling, but in a good way to end an episode. Story 100, Vittoria acabou essa historia. Victory, end of the story. Story sazed, boldogon eltek, mig megnem holtok. Story 102, Danish, og de levede lykkeligt til deres dages ende. English, and they lived happily to the end of their days. Story 103, e vissero per sempre felici e contenti. And then they lived happily ever after. Story 104, once upon a time, long before your grandfather's grandfather was born. Stoi sin, iban se felizus iban mangia pastissus. They were happy and ate cakes. Story 106, og de levede lykkeligt til deres dages ende. And they lived happily till the end of their days. Story 107, Denmark. Snip snap snude, nu den historie ude. Snip snap snout, now the story is out. Story 108, in Hebrew, and they lived with happiness and wealth until this very day. Hem chayu beoshel veoshel adetzemayomazeh. Story 109, a žili šťastně až do smrti. And they lived happily until their death. A žili šťastně až do smrti, dokud na ně nedošla temnota. And they lived happily until their death, until darkness fell upon them. Story 110, Polish. I zyli dlugo I successly. Literal translation, and they lived long and happy. Story 111, I svi su živjeli dugo I sretno. And everybody lived long and happily. Story 112, Colorín, colorado, este cuento se ha acabado. Y colorín, colorete, hacia el cielo va un cohete. Colorín, colorado, este cuento se ha acabado. Story 113, Cuban Spanish. Colorín, colorado, este cuento se ha acabado. In English, read, this story has come to an end. It makes more sense because of the rhyme in Spanish. Story 114, in Russian, fairy tales often end with I žili ani dolga I shaslava, which literally means, and they lived long and happily. It's the same cozy vibe as the English version. Story 115. Toen kwam een olifant met een hele lange snuit en blies het verhaal weer uit. Story 116. Kinda sweet, but also a little scary at the same time. Fairy tales were never just for kids. Huh? Story 117. In Finnish, you can say Jahi ilivat ilamansa analizanalapunosti, which roughly translates to, and they lived their lives happily until the end. Estoy 118. Fueron felices y comieron perdices. They lived happily ever after and ate lots of partridge. Story 119. Snip, snop, snute, så är äventyret ute. Direct translation. Snip, snap, snut, and the adventure is over. It rhymes better in Norwegian. Storia katonikosi, kiaftizisan kala kiemiska litera. And they lived well and we lived better. Story 121. Colorín colorado, este cuento se ha acabado. Fueron felices y comieron perdices. Colorín colorado, this story has ended. They were happy and ate partridges. Story 122. This is a repost of what I wrote under user Rickpat's comment, but I felt compelled to elaborate further. Here in Mallorca, we speak a dialect of Catalan. Our folktales are called rondes. They have a very blunt style, with barely any flourishes or poetic intent. They go straight to the facts. Most end very abruptly with some variation of, I encara son viasis I no son morts. And they are still alive if they aren't dead. I love the vagueness of it, as if the narrator is in a hurry to end the story and couldn't be bothered to go and check. Anuta klusing raza Islandia, y el cel mos bajem tots plegats. Amen. And in heaven may we all see each other. Amen. Usually this follows the previous one, but it can also appear on its own. Another typical ending is, I kano ho krajai ho via a surkar. And whoever doesn't believe it may go look it up. The passive-aggressive tone is delicious. Buenas disclusing ramark. Y això es sarundaya. Si vos agrada, mengeu la bus frita, mengeu vos la torrada. Y si no us agrada, tirau la dau sa taulada. And this is the rondea. If you like it, eat it fried, eat it toasted. And if you don't like it, throw it over the roof. In translation, it loses the rhyme. Some end mid-action, for example with someone cooking or counting their riches, and the final line is, and he's still doing it if he hasn't stopped. Stori sas huson harum, ito vige, foi servire. It means, here is the end. Run away with it. Storia katonikos itesera. Vemos typical expression in Greek is they lived well and we lived better. But I remember and voi grani always saying kimuna ke voi kimena kokinovraki meaning and I was there too. Verim red underpants. Story 125. I żyli długo I szczęśliwie. And they lived long and happily. Story 126. I am from Mexico. Even when they lived happily ever after is used, there is usually no fixed final phrase in the stories, but people often say both are over. Story 127. Ils vécurent heureux et eurent beaucoup d'enfants. They lived happily and had many children. Story 128. In Kannada, one of the South Indian languages, stories often end with the phrase Adatamil Avarella Sukhavaji Baladaru. The word sukha means comfortably, contentedly, and without troubles, which is stronger than merely happy. They lived comfortably is the closest English equivalent. Story 129. И они жили долго и счастливо. Story 130. Ojita levied lik till dears dies endi translates directly as, and they lived happily to their day's end, meaning happily ever after. I am Danish. Story 131. Kanti. Amnit moiten tunt janten, vas on kotlinga susi ha, yanig yuking rushchaz. They rode through the endless lands. All their enemies fell before them like the fading northern lights. Story 132. En ze leefden nog lang en gelukkig. And they lived happily ever after. Story 133. И жили они долго и счастливо. Story 134. Sat janam tak sath rehenge. They will be together for 7 lives. Story 135. En ze leefden nog lang en gelukkig. And they lived long and happily. Story 136. In Greek we say, we lived well. They lived even better. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.